We've got new drivers with big changes as well as no changes. Let's take a look. In today's video, we're going to take a look at the old drivers versus the new drivers that came out in April 2024. We've got a lot of tests to cover, so let's dive into it. Some quick information before we start the test. The synthetic benchmarks were done on turbo mode on the previous driver test and 30 watt on the new drivers, so they won't line up perfectly. All results are from a 3-test average to remain as accurate as possible. AMD fluid motion frames were not used on any of the tests today. We'll start off with Timespy at 20 watts. There's a slight advantage for the new drivers, about 150 points, which is actually pretty substantial. And at 30 watt / turbo mode, this result isn't going to be the most accurate because the old drivers were run at turbo where the new ones were run at 30 watt custom. Moving over to Geekbench 6 at 20 watts, we can see that they're pretty much the same. The difference is down to margin of error. It's only a few points. And moving over to turbo mode / 30 watt, you can see that turbo mode actually does make a difference. It's got just under 700 points advantage here. These were included just to see the difference between 30 watt and turbo mode. Now looking at the CPU score at 20 watt, there's a little bit of an advantage for the old drivers. And once again, with the turbo mode, we see an advantage for the old drivers for the multi-core score. We'll move on to the game test now. Turbo mode is not a factor in those tests, so it's more of a one-to-one comparison. So let's take a look. I've added some new games, but we'll start off with Old Faithful here. So we have Forza Horizon 5 running pretty much the same at 20 watts. Seems like this game has finally stabilized. We used to get a lot more movement in the previous drivers and BIOS updates. And then taking a look at 30 watts, pretty much the same thing. A very slight advantage for the old drivers, about a frame and a half in the average. Overall though, I would say no real change between the drivers. But taking a look at Forza Motorsport, there is actually an advantage here. When we take a look at the results for the 20 watt, you can see that there's a slight advantage for the new drivers, but oddly enough, when we switch over to 30 watts, it's actually completely the flip. Again, not a major difference though, so I would say that it's not really something that I'd be worried about. And then for Starfield, it seems that the new drivers are performing better at 20 watts. We have about a, 7 frame advantage here. And when we switch over to 30 watt, you can see that there's still an advantage for the new drivers, but it's not as dramatic as it is at 20 watt. It seems to be only about a 3 frame advantage on the average here. And looking at Cyberpunk at 20 watts, we have pretty well the same performance between the previous drivers and the new ones, so no changes here at 20 watt. And looking at 30 watts, same story, not really any change. There's a slight advantage here for the previous drivers, but again, down to margin of error. I think we've got all we can get out of Cyberpunk at this point. Next up, we've got God of War at 20 watts. There's a very slight advantage for the old drivers. It's really, again, down to margin of error, only about a frame and a half. And then taking a look at 30 watts, same thing. There's not really any difference between the drivers. It's down to margin of error. It seems like some of the older games are about as optimized as they're going to get. We're probably not going to see any gains going forward. And that rings true for Shadow of the Tomb Raider as well. It's pretty well the same results. We have about a half a frame difference between the old and the new. And that's at both 20 watt and 30 watt. I think where we're going to see most of the changes is probably with some of these newer games that are coming up right away. Now we're going to transition to some newer games. We'll start off first with Helldivers 2, and at 20 watt, you can see that there's a decent advantage for the new drivers here. Although something funky happening with the 1% low, so I think they're going to need to do some more tweaking for this game. And that pattern carries over also to 30 watts, so hopefully we'll get some tweaks for the 1% low. But that's probably for the next driver update. My last game to cover here is Horizon Forbidden West, so this is a new one I've just started testing. And you can see the new driver is performing better across the board at 20 watts. And at 30 watts, same thing. I just recorded in the beginning area, so these frames are not necessarily high action sequences. The update wasn't just about game performance, there was also a new feature that was added, so let's take a look at that. And if you go to the AMD Adrenalin app, which interestingly is called AMD Adrenalin instead of the AMD app now, if you head to the gaming tab and then click on graphics, you can see that they've added the AMD fluid motion frames and the anti-lag setting. So turn these on, give it a test, and see how it works for you. And some final thoughts. The biggest thing is obviously the AMD fluid motion frames that they've added, so I haven't played with that too much. I know some people have complained about the lag on it, so make sure that you have your anti-lag turned on. It certainly does help a bit, but it can't necessarily fix everything because we are inserting frames in between, which naturally is going to introduce some lag. One thing to note is that if you're using fluid motion frames, I believe that RSR will not work in conjunction with it, so you're going to have to pick between the two. I haven't personally tested that, but that's what I've been hearing online, so just keep that in mind when you're testing it out. And about the game driver performance, I think for some of the older games, we've squeezed out pretty much everything we're going to get out of it, so any of the changes I think are just going to be to some of the newer titles. It seems like with all these driver updates and the BIOS updates, we're finally tapping the potential of the Z1 Extreme. So from here on forth, I think it's just going to be updating for newer titles. But that's going to wrap it up for this one. I hope you enjoyed this video and thank you for watching.